This is a tough story to tell, and I really want you to watch all of it if you can. Don't do it for me. Do it so that the memory of the people I'm going to talk about won't be lost to the halls of injustice. Black people have suffered so much in this country, but it is our job to tell as many of our stories as we can. And that's what I've endeavored to do. And I really want you to continue joining me on this journey as I tell the stories of the forgotten Black people. This stuff is hard to hear, but it is necessary. And today, I want to tell you about what happened to the Lowman family in 1925. Racial mob violence against Black people during the Jim Crow South was somewhat confusing, not just because it was a barbaric tactic that brought out the worst in humanity, but because it wasn't needed for the purpose that white mobs claimed that they were doing it for. White mobs often said that they lynched to keep Black people in line and to protect their communities from what they perceived to be Black criminality. But here's why that does not make sense. In the Jim Crow South, in many states, there wasn't a single Black judge or a single Black prosecuting attorney, and frankly, most of the juries were composed of all white men. White rule was complete in the Jim Crow South. They controlled every lever of power in the individual state. So what was the purpose of this barbaric tactic? There was no place for Black people to escape the punishment that the white mobs believed that Black people so rightly deserved. So again, what was the purpose of it? Well, that was the question that the Charleston Courier asked in 1897. Yet, this practice continued without any hindrance for another 5 decades. Why was that? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It was the hatred and base need to reaffirm white male rule. The Black person represented all of the frustrations that white society had in a caste system that said that they were on top and Black people were on the bottom. And anytime a Black person did anything or said anything that was perceived to be an affront to this caste system, the result was racial violence against Black people. In many instances, racial mob violence was often in conflict with the government's desire to use the law to reaffirm white rule. In 1906, a mentally disabled Black man in his early 20s named Bob Davis was accused of attempting to attack a 20-year-old white woman who was the daughter of a prominent Greenwood, South Carolina farmer. The governor at the time, Duncan Hayward, he viewed racial mob violence as a stain on the character of whites. As many as 1,000 white men came together to find Davis. Governor Hayward made a personal appeal to the mob and came to the alleged victim's home. The governor told the mob that he understood their anger. He told the mob that South Carolina was on trial before the civilized world and they had to let the law play out. The governor promised the mob that Davis would be tried within 2 weeks and that some of them could serve as jurors to convict him. He said that it was better for Davis to be legally executed. The mob and the victim's family told the governor that there was no earthly chance that he could save Davis. The mob brutally lynched Davis shortly after that. I tell you that story to give you some understanding and context as to what happened to the Black family I'm going to talk about in this video. The law was surrounded by white rule, and yet the mob still wanted to enact its version of Jim Crow justice on this Black family. Sam and Annie Lowman lived in South Carolina in the early 1900s. Sam Lowman was born around 1869. His parents were formerly enslaved Black people. Sam could read and write, and in 1891, he married Annie. Together, they had 8 children. 2 of their sons, Dozier and Lester, served in World War I. The Lowmans were farmers, and they had been self-sufficient since around 1897. Sam had paid property taxes on an estate that was worth several $100s for over 25 years. In 1906, he purchased a 146-acre tract of land near Monetta and sold it in 1913. He then bought another 100-acre tract of land in 1913 and sold it in 1918. In 1924, Sam Lowman moved his family from Saluda County, South Carolina to Aiken County to work on a farm near Monetta. On April 25, 1925, the day began as a regular day for the Lowman family. By 8 a.m., 55-year-old Sam Lowman left home to take corn to be milled. His wife, 50-year-old Annie, was outside behind the house making soap over a hot fire. Their 27-year-old daughter, Bertha, was pregnant at the time and was in the backyard with their 13-year-old niece, Naomi. Another niece, 18-year-old Eleanora, she was cleaning the porch. Meanwhile, Damon, who was Sam and Annie's 21-year-old son, and his teenage cousin Clarence were in the field plowing. Damon's wife, Rosa, was preparing the midday meal for the family, and his 18-year-old sister Bertie was feeding Damon and Rosa's 1-month-old baby. The Lowmans were doing exactly what they did every day, but that's when Jim Crow came knocking at their door. The Lowmans had found themselves caught up in something that had nothing to do with them. In 1920, Sam Lowman's landlord, a man named Will Hartley, he lent $1,000 to a man named Chester Swearingen. The two men then drew up a chattel mortgage for 2 mules. In 1921, Hartley filed a lawsuit against Swearingen to recover his money. Hartley then took the 2 mules and repossessed them and gave them to Sam. To get back at Hartley, it's believed that Swearingen and others told the Aiken County Sheriff, a man named Henry Hampton Howard, that the Lowmans were selling whiskey out of their home. Now, this is not just an allegation about violating prohibition laws at the time. You see, at the time in Aiken County, there was a huge bootleg liquor operation that was being controlled by the Klan and a gang known as the Famous 17. This whiskey ring was made up of local politicians and law enforcement officers and other really important and high-profile people who used liquor raids to take out the competition. Sheriff Howard was a member of the Klan and had an interest in protecting the liquor ring. On April 25, 1925, Sheriff Howard and 3 deputies, Nolly Robinson, Arthur Shepard, and Robert McElhenney, also members of the Klan, came to the Lowman's home to raid it. Around 9 a.m., Clarence and Damon had finished plowing the field. That's when 2 cars pulled up. There were white men inside both cars. They asked Damon if he knew where Sam Lowman lived. The man that Damon was speaking to was Aiken County Sheriff's Deputy Nolly Robinson. He was in an unmarked car with Sheriff Henry Howard. None of these men identified themselves as law enforcement, and they were not wearing their uniforms or anything else that would give the impression that they were law enforcement. Damon told the men that his father did live there. The men then rushed to the Lowman's house. Sheriff Howard and deputies Robinson and Shepard and McElhenney hurried out of their cars and ran to the back of the Lowman's home. When they got there, they encountered Annie and Bertha. The 2 women screamed and tried to run for the house. Eleanora and Naomi ran away from the home altogether to get away from what was going on. Inside the house, Rosa heard the screaming and immediately grabbed her baby just as Deputy Shepard was about to enter the Lowman's home. Bertie ran away when she saw the men's weapons. At the front of the house, Deputy McElhenney was entering, and when he heard the screaming out back, he ran through the house to the back where he saw Sheriff Howard and Deputy Robinson struggling with Annie and Bertha, who were refusing to let the men into the house. Damon then grabbed a weapon and he ran to the back to help his family out. At this point, he still didn't know what was going on. He began to struggle with Sheriff Howard and Deputy Robinson. Before it was over, shots were fired and Sheriff Howard was fatally wounded. The sheriff's deputy said that it was the Lowmans that fired at the sheriff and took his life. Deputy Shepard fired at Annie Lowman and she was struck above her left eye. She died immediately. Pregnant Bertha, she was pistol whipped and fired her in her abdomen and the right side of her chest and arms by Deputy Nolly Robinson. Damon managed to exchange fire with the deputies and he was also struck, but he was able to escape to his cousin's home 3 miles away. Clarence Lowman was fired at by deputies Robinson and Shepard, and he was struck in the shoulder and the legs. He also managed to run into the woods. Bertha was near death and she was rushed to a hospital where her unborn baby died. While all of this was going on, Sam Lowman was having meal ground at a local mill. He was arrested afterwards. 2 days later, a man named Clint followed. He claimed that he found 2 jars of whiskey buried behind the Lowman's chicken house. On his word alone, Sam Lowman was charged and sentenced to 2 years in prison on the chain gang. The rest of the Lowmans were arrested and charged with taking the sheriff's life. Sheriff Howard's body was escorted from the funeral home by a procession of over 100 Klan members dressed in their full regalia to the county courthouse for a public viewing. The governor of South Carolina at the time, Thomas McLeod, he spoke to a crowd of over 1,600 people at the Aiken Baptist Church at Sheriff Howard's funeral. He talked about how Howard was a man of great humanity. The same man that terrorized the Lowman family for no reason at all was talked about as if he was a saint. The Lowmans were arraigned in early May. The judge in the case was Judge Hayne Rice, another prominent member of the Klan in Aiken. Rice appointed another member, John Edwin Stansfield, to head the Lowmans defense team. The Lowmans trial began on May 12, 1925. The 5 Lowman family members were under heavy guard because there were fears that mob violence would occur at any moment and the mob would take the Lowmans and lynch them. Clarence Lowman was under great danger because everyone believed that he was the one that fired the fatal shot at Sheriff Howard. But this was not based on any evidence at all. Now, here's an interesting twist to the story. It's believed that the sheriff was not fired at by any of the Lowmans. Damon Lowman was not close enough to the sheriff to have fired at him, and there were rumors spread around town that it was actually Deputy Nolly Robinson that fired at the sheriff and took his life, because the sheriff was about to fire him. 2 days after the sheriff's death, Nolly Robinson was appointed sheriff of Aiken County. The Lowmans never stood a chance at receiving a fair trial. During the opening statements, Aiken prosecutor Bert Carter, he told the jury that The Lowmans had conspired to take the sheriff's life and that they knew full well who he was when he showed up that day. Jim Crow was present in their courtroom and caused the Lowmans to turn on one another. Facing the possibility of going to the electric chair, Damon and Clarence told conflicting stories about one another as to who was responsible for Sheriff Howard's death. Prior to the trial, Damon and Clarence stated that it was Annie that likely fired the fatal shot at Sheriff Howard because the weapon that the police claimed was used was by the kitchen door where Annie had struggled with Howard when he was in the back of the house. Then, at trial, Damon said that Clarence had confessed to him in jail that it was Clarence that fired at the sheriff. Jim Crow had caused panic and had caused fear in the Lowmans as they tried to save their lives by blaming and implicating one another. Damon knew that by offering up his mother Annie as the culprit that it would not be enough because she was already dead and that would not satisfy the mob. By blaming his 14-year-old cousin Clarence, Damon hoped to save his life along with Bertha, Bertie, and Rosa's lives. At the close of the trial, Judge Rice issued directed verdicts of not guilty for Rosa and Bertie Lowman because both of the women had fled the house before the firing began. The judge then proceeded to tell the jury that the sheriff had a legal right to be there and that they had the right to search the Lowman's home. The judge said nothing of the fact that the sheriff and his deputies did not identify themselves as law enforcement and did not have on uniforms. He told the jury that if one of the Lowmans was guilty, they were all guilty. The jury deliberated for 80 minutes and shortly after 5 p.m. on May 12, 1925, the jury found Clarence and Damon and Bertha guilty of taking the sheriff's life. The next morning, Judge Rice, he sentenced Clarence and Damon to die by electrocution, and he sentenced Bertha to spend the rest of her life in prison. None of the Lowmans' attorneys filed appeals on their behalf. Black attorney Nathaniel J. Frederick filed an appeal with the South Carolina Supreme Court for the Lowmans. Frederick was one of the most accomplished forgotten civil rights advocates of the Jim Crow era. I don't have time to tell you everything I want to say about him because there's just too much to say and we'd be here all day. But what I will say is that he was a legal giant long before the rise of Thurgood Marshall and the other legal titans of the modern civil rights movement. Frederick argued over 30 cases in front of the South Carolina Supreme Court on behalf of his black clients. He was also the head of the Howard School, South Carolina's only public school for black children at that time. He was also the owner and editor of the Palmetto Leader, a black newspaper that spoke out against racial violence against black people in South Carolina. In his appeal, Attorney Frederick argued that the trial judge was wrong in instructing the jury that the sheriff and the deputies acted lawfully, despite the fact that they did not identify themselves as law enforcement. He also made other arguments on how the judge's instructions to the jury biased the Lowmans. The state Supreme Court agreed and unanimously reversed the Lowmans' convictions. The court said that there was no evidence that the Lowmans entered into a conspiracy to attack the officers because they were at their own home and did not know that they were law enforcement officers. The Lowmans' second trial began on October 5, 1926. A new judge was appointed by the governor to preside over the case. Nathaniel Frederick represented the Lowmans this time. He also brought a white attorney named Lawrence Southard to help him. The prosecution used the same playbook from the first trial and presented no new evidence this time. Attorneys Frederick and Southard asked the trial judge to find Bertha and also Damon Lowman not guilty because the state put on the same evidence that the state Supreme Court had already said was insufficient to sustain a guilty verdict against them. They argued that the Lowmans had acted in self-defense when the sheriff and the deputies came to their home. The judge agreed and acquitted Damon, but that wasn't the end of it. As soon as he was acquitted, Damon was immediately recharged again with assault and battery so that the police could keep him in jail. The judge said that he would recess court until the next morning to consider whether or not to acquit Bertha and also Clarence. The decision to find Damon not guilty sealed the Lowmans' fate. The white community believed that the Lowmans were going to be found guilty and sent to the electric chair. The fact that the Lowmans got what appeared to be a small sliver of fairness was too much for some to take. Within an hour of that verdict, news had already reached Columbia that the Lowmans would be lynched that night. The governor's office had heard of the mob violence that was planned and warned the officials in Aiken and the judge, but they did nothing to protect the Lowmans. Sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning on Friday, October 8th, 150 masked men arrived at the jail. Sheriff Robinson and other deputies came into the jail where they were. They unlocked the Lowman cells. They then walked them out of the jail and handed them over to a mob. There was laughter and jovial conversation in the jail as the Lowmans were handed over to the waiting mob. Bertha Lowman screamed in terror because she knew what was about to happen. Outside the jail, there were 5 cars waiting to take them and the mob to the site where their lives would be taken. Clarence Lowman ran and tried to escape. Someone in the mob fired at him and captured him. Clarence was struck when he was fired at, and to avoid getting blood in the back of the mob member's car, they tied Clarence to the bumper and dragged him 2 miles to the campground where the mob had planned to carry out this horrific act and take their lives. When the Lowmans arrived at the campground, they found over 200 cars and over 1,000 people waiting for them. Before the act was carried out, the Lowmans were forced to stand 50 feet apart. The mob members then turned on their headlights. They did this so they could see to ensure that they would not miss anything. Pierce Howard, who was a nephew of Sheriff Howard, was given the honor of being the executioner that night. But he got cold feet and could not go through with it. That's when deputies McElhenney and Shepard stepped up to take over for him. They were 2 of the men who attacked the Lowmans with Sheriff Howard. They took Damon's life first, but it seemed like the mob took pleasure in what they did to Bertha because they made her death slow and painful. Bertha begged for a life and crawled on the ground after being fired at and struck. They fired a blast at her with a large weapon. It was so powerful that her clothes caught on fire. She died there on the ground in front of all of those who had their headlights on. This horrific act sent shockwaves and outrage throughout all of South Carolina. It was bad for South Carolina's reputation because it said that lawlessness was tolerated. Newspapers condemned what happened, and there were calls for an investigation and to bring the mob members to justice. Governor Thomas McCloud vowed to appoint a commission to investigate and to do what he could to find those responsible. Now, let me stop right here for just 1 second. This outrage that those in power were expressing was more than just sadness for what happened to the Lowmans. It was about state sovereignty and power. Racial mob violence had long been a problem in the Jim Crow South, and the NAACP and others had been trying to get Congress to pass a federal anti-lynching law, but Congress refused to do so. Over 100 anti-lynching bills were introduced in Congress between 1882 and 1952. Not a single one of them passed. Southern legislators have blocked them every time. Most southern states have passed laws making lynching illegal, but these laws were never enforced, and this is why the NAACP fought so hard for a federal anti-lynching bill. Congress came close to passing one in 1922 when the House of Representatives passed the Dyer anti-lynching bill, named for its sponsor, Leonidas Dyer, a congressman from Missouri. The bill failed in the Senate. Southern legislators led the opposition to the bill. Their most common reason was that the federal government should not tell the southern states how to deal with black people. So the fact that the Lowmans could be taken from the jail and handed over to a mob of 1,000 people undermines South Carolina and other states' argument that a federal law was not necessary. South Carolina had an interest in making sure that it appeared that they were trying to capture and prosecute the mob because failure to do so would confirm what everyone already knew, and that was that southern states did not care about black people being subjected to mob violence. Hours after this horrific event, a judge ordered that the Aiken County Grand Jury meet that day at noon to conduct a thorough investigation into what happened. The Lowmans were later buried in one large grave. After this, a disgruntled member of the Aiken County Klan wrote to NAACP Secretary James Weldon Johnson and told him that the Lowmans had been the victim of racial mob violence in Aiken. Johnson asked future NAACP leader Walter White to look into this. White was the leading authority on lynching in America, and because he could pass for white, he would often go undercover to investigate acts of mob violence in the South. On October 24th, he arrived in Aiken and identified himself as a newspaper investigator. He learned that after Damon Lowman was acquitted, Sheriff Robinson, who was also a member of the Klan, had planned the event in the law offices of John Edwin Stanfield. Stanfield had been one of Damon's court-appointed attorneys at his first trial. White came back and wrote a letter to the governor, and he detailed exactly what he had learned. There was pressure on the governor to do something about this. But not everyone in South Carolina was against the mob. In Aiken, the mob was fiercely defended as having done a good thing. Edgar Brown, one of the attorneys for 2 of the mob members, said that the investigation was a joke and that nobody wanted the mob punished. He blamed the northern news media, who he claimed supported black people and not the good white people of the South, who occasionally had to deal with what he called black brutes. The Klan held a Thanksgiving Day rally where they lit a cross in support of the mob. It was a community event. The mood became so tense in Aiken that many black people felt that Attorney Frederick would be the next victim and he'd be whipped. He was taken out of Aiken by concerned black people for his own protection. Sam Lowman was paroled in 1927. The NAACP held a large rally for him in Philadelphia upon his release. Sam had spent 17 months on a chain gang. His entire family had been lynched. Sam later said that he saw his children being dragged out of the jail that night and he could not do anything to help them. Sam said that he would never return to South Carolina again. What happened to the Lowmans is just one example of mob violence overtaking the rule of law and no one coming to black people's defense. The Lowmans did nothing to deserve what happened to them. Their only crime was being black. And the reason the rule of law and the justice system abandoned them was also because they were black. I want to know your thoughts on this video. Had you ever heard of the Lowman family, and how did it make you feel learning all that they went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.